Okay, now this is a little more detail about simplicity, complexity. What we find in simplicity is that the sample is more likely to be illiterate rather than literate, to have, but again, in some domains there can be exceptions. So as I mentioned to you earlier, there is little rather than much education or cultivation of the domains, and there is low social class versus high social class. Let's go to the next one. There, usually you find little travel in the case of the simple cultures, and in the case of the complex cultures you find much travel. Homogeneity of values is different, much more homogeneity in the simple, much more heterogeneity in the values in the complex. Communication tends to be associative in the simple. There's a very primitive form of communication. For example, if somebody was found dead, you ask, who was there? And they say, oh, well, whoever was there was the one who did it. Well, that's associative. There's the association. He was there, therefore he did it. We have more complicated systems now for thinking about this. And so this is a more analytical way of thinking. Magical thinking is a very common phenomenon in the simple cultures. You'd see a lot of magic. In Africa, in many samples, they say, if you get sick, it's because one of your neighbors sort of did something. They wanted to get you sick. And that's really magical thinking. On the other hand, the opposite side would be experimental, evidence-based thinking. We do careful randomized experiments, etc., etc. That's really much more complicated and very different from magical thinking. Okay, let's go to the next one. Are we going? Yeah. Okay, religion is important in the simpler cultures and relatively unimportant in the complex cultures. The simple are more parochial, the complex are more cosmopolitan, and a very interesting kind of argument about what is the basis of laws. In the simpler, the laws are primarily come from the gods. The gods sort of create the laws. Then a little more advanced, more complex is that the aristocracy creates the laws. And finally, the more complex is that the people create the laws. And now it's interesting that this typology was developed in 1744 by an Italian called Vico in a book called The New Science. And what the Taliban is trying to do now, and many of these extremists in Islam, is to go back to Sharia law, which is the law of the gods. That is the more primitive form of law, and they avoid democracy, which is the law that comes from the people. So you get an interesting kind of correspondence here between complexity on the one hand and the way you think about the basis for law. Let's go on to the next one. Next one. Okay, now I'm getting into tightness, looseness much more in detail. And this is a study that was done by Michelle Gelfand. I will show you the reference in a minute. And she found that high population density and a history of conflict and many natural disasters and diseases and few resources and generally an agricultural environment where there is also food deprivation, all of these characteristics seem to be tied or related to tightness. On the other hand, low density, peacefulness, etc., when there are no diseases, people are much looser. So that's what Michelle Gelfand found. Let's go on to the next one because she has quite a bit on that. Here's the reference. The most tight societies, she only had 33 countries, so there are 190 countries, so she had only a small sample, but nevertheless, you get an idea. The tightest that she had was Pakistan, Malaysia, and Singapore. I was in Singapore a couple of times and for a couple of months each time. And I must say, this is a tight society. You do not cross the street against the red light. You do things in very, very careful ways. There's a great advantage in that, of course, because you don't kill people, because if you cross the street on a red light, you're likely to be killed. So there are advantages, but nevertheless, it's a society in which things are very tight, and I can feel it. I remember saying, I like to study how people think about ethnic groups in this place. And they say, oh, no, we don't want to talk about that. We just don't want to know what people think about ethnic groups because we are supposed to just love every ethnic group. So we don't want to find out that somebody doesn't like somebody. So you see how tight they were about that idea to study prejudice in that place. The next group, Turkey and Japan, a little less tight. A little loose, France and New Zealand. And the most loose that she had was Brazil, Israel, and Ukraine. Let's go to the next one. Okay, now tightness at the personal level was correlated with spirituality, belief in fate, religiosity. People attend religious services frequently, and they reject divorce and immorality, and there is less use of alcohol, drugs, and these kinds of things. People live a clean life, in a sense. And actually, that also helps them live a long time because in Singapore, for example, they live longer than we do. They don't abuse the environment as much and so on. So let's go to the next one. Are we going? Yeah. Okay, this is the way I paraphrased what Gelfand found. That in tight cultures, people are more conservative, obedient, they prefer a strong leader, they accept autocracy, the mass media are closed, essentially you can't say whatever you want. You see, they see the main purpose of government to be to maintain law and order and to protect from foreign influences. They prefer radical to incremental change, and there is high dependence on houses of worship. Attendance, houses of worship, and in most situations, things are tight. The situations can also be thought as being tight or loose. For example, in a church, the situation is tight. At a party, it is loose. So you can think about situations as being tight or loose, and they have many tight situations in tight cultures, whereas in loose cultures, they have mostly loose situations. So that's another way of thinking about it. Okay, let's go to the next one. That seems to be stuck. Ah, good. Okay. What Gelfand found, she measured both tightness, individualism, and collectivism, and these are the correlations that she got. So you can see there is a relationship in the 0.4 area, and an interesting point she made is that while individualism is correlated with gross national product per capita and with subjective well-being, tightness, looseness is not related to subjective well-being. So that's a way to distinguish individualism, collectivism from tightness, looseness. Let's go on to the next one. Okay. Now, here are some of the consequences of tightness. Think of Singapore. Low crime, low homicide rates, low participation in political actions, low tolerance for immoral actions such as cheating. It's one of the cleanest places from the point of view of corruption in the world. There is this index that is done, it's called the Berlin Index of Corruption. And they are in the same category as the Scandinavian countries. They don't have corruption. There is more ethnocentrism, and there is little immigration from other cultures. They are relatively tight. They don't want these other people who are different to come in and mess things up. Okay, next one. Now, let's talk about collectivism and individualism in more detail. This is the one dimension that has been studied more than any other. And it's not only that I wrote a book about individualism, collectivism, but it is one that really has been studied a lot by a lot of people. So here is one way of defining this dimension. Let's talk about collectivism. What kind of self is in collectivist cultures? The way we study this is we ask people to complete 20 statements that begin with the words I am. I am what? Now, in collectivist cultures, you get a relationship. They say, I'm an uncle, or I'm a member of this group or that group, etc. They talk about relationships in collectivist cultures. In individualist cultures, on the other hand, they talk about individual characteristics. They say, I'm a musician, I'm a tennis player, whatever it is. But they don't talk about groups. Then the next one, goal structure. In collectivist cultures, the group goals and the individual goals tend to be related, tend to be consistent. In individualist cultures, they're not necessarily consistent. If you want something and your family doesn't want that, that doesn't mean that you're going to do what your family wants done. You probably will do what you want done. So that's individualism. In collectivism, you will go with the family. You will do what the family wants. The importance of norms. In collectivist cultures, the norms are very important. Much more important than attitudes. In individualist cultures, on the other hand, attitudes are very important. Norms, yeah, they are important, but not nearly as important as attitudes. And you see what happens then, we have a psychology of attitudes that is very elaborate here. We know a great deal about attitudes, but we don't know very much about norms because we use attitudes as predictors of behavior in individualistic cultures. So we study attitudes, and the result is our psychology has much more attitudes in it than norms. Then another difference is whether people stay or leave a group that they don't like. In collectivist cultures, they are likely to stay with a group even if they don't like it, whereas in individualist cultures, they're likely to leave the group if they don't like it. Or at least they will start looking around to see if they can find another group that is better for them. Let's go on to the next one. There is a study that was done by Wasti in which she looked at what happens to workers who don't like their job in Turkey. What she found was that if they were collectivists, they stayed with the job. They just didn't leave. If they were individuals, on the other hand, they tried to find another job. Now, these are a couple of references you might want to have. They cover this topic very well. And let's go on to the next one. Okay, now, when we say that a culture is collectivist or individualist, we really have to pay attention to what I call control variables. In other words, if you take Japan generally is more collectivist than individualist. However, if you are an upper class Japanese, you are likely to be more individualist than collectivist. So you have to take social class into account. Affluence is very important. If you are an affluent Japanese, you are more likely to be individualist, even though Japan on the whole is collectivist. Education tends to be, again, in the direction of individualism. Age, on the other hand, is in the other direction. The older samples are more collectivist than the younger samples. There are several studies in which high school students, their parents, and their grandparents were asked questions which measured individualism and collectivism, and what they found was that in the older generations, they are collectivists, in the middle generations, not so much, and the young people are individualists. So you have a continuum here that you really should pay attention to, because the Japanese who tend to be very young may be actually individualists. And there are regional variations within each country. For example, in our northeast, we find more individualists than in our southeast. And you will find that this also has some relevance to voting. People who are more individualists are more likely to vote for Obama than people who are more collectivist. Then social mobility is relevant. People who change their jobs a lot are more individualists than people who stay in one job for a long time. Exposure to the mass media is relevant. Those who are exposed to the mass media are more individualist than those who don't look at the mass media very much. And finally, those who have salient common fate. In other words, you have a group that is being attacked by somebody, then they have a salient common fate. They become much more collectivist. On the other hand, if they don't have such a thing, then they might be more individualist. Let's go to the next one. Okay, now we can mix the syndromes in various ways. And here's an example of mixing, where if we take collectivism and individualism, and we can take the horizontal and the vertical side, and we can find four kinds of societies. In the horizontal collectivists, an example is the Israeli kibbutz. They are equal and they are collectivists. In vertical collectivists, on the other hand, a good example would be an Indian village. In an Indian village, there's a lot of hierarchy, and they are collectivists. A horizontal individualist, a good example would be Sweden and Australia. They say that in Australia, if you stick out too much, they're likely to cut you down. This is a study by one of the Australian psychologists. He calls this tall poppies are cut down. But in our culture, if you stick out, it's fine, it's great. And we especially are very high on vertical individualism, where competition is extremely important as a value in academia, in corporations, and so on. So you can see here different kinds of cultures depending on how we mix the various syndromes. Okay, let's go on to the next one. All right. Now, we have personality that also corresponds to collectivism, individualism. We call them allocentric and idiocentric. The allocentrics correspond to collectivism, the idiocentrics correspond to individualism. And the most important consideration is the fit between culture and personality. If you have Allocentrics in a collectivist culture, then that's fine. They fit very nicely. But allocentrics in an individualist culture, they don't fit very well. Similarly, idiocentrics in a collectivist culture do not fit well, but in an individualist culture, they fit fine. There's an interesting study done in Germany when there was East Germany and West Germany. East Germany was more collectivist than West Germany. And a lot of people from East Germany moved to West Germany. And the study measured their allocentrism, idocentrism, and then they looked at how well they adjusted to West Germany. And what they found was that when they were allocentrics, they did not adjust well. When they were idiocentrics, they adjusted wonderfully. So it depends on the fit between culture and personality. And there are even studies showing that psychiatric problems emerge when there is a bad fit between the person and the culture. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, now I have a long list of things that collectivists tend to do. And I don't think I need to sort of spend too much time on this because it will take a lot of time. And we have this delay in the way the slides are moving. So I will just mention one or two things on each of the slides. And then you have the slides so you can pay attention to this. And you can also see the references that I mentioned. Now, holistic thinking is interesting because there's more holistic thinking in collectivist samples. They sort of take a lot of the environment into account before they make a judgment. There's a study in which fish were swimming in an environment that had lots of plants. And people were asked, what do you see? Well, the collectivists saw both the plants and the fish. The individualists saw mostly the fish. They ignored the plants. So you can see the environment didn't really register that much with the individualism. Another example, what kinds of words do they use? The collectivists use words like we, us, ours, etc. The individualists use much more I, mine, and me than otherwise. Okay, let's go to the next one. This large difference between behavior towards the in-group and out-group is very important. There is a big difference in how you behave. You behave with self-sacrifice towards the in-group, but with the out-group, you're pretty harsh. The behavior is much more sort of harsh in the case of collectivists. Not so much in the case of individualists. Individualists do not differentiate between in-group and out-group that much. Okay, tolerance for inconsistency is an interesting phenomenon. You have much more tolerance for inconsistency in collectivism than in individualism. Here's another one that's important, communication. Collectivists pay a lot of attention to how somebody said something, as opposed to what was said. And a good example occurred in Geneva when Secretary Baker was talking to the Iraqis in 1990. And he told them very, very clearly, that's what he was saying. What? He said, if you don't get out of Kuwait, we're going to attack you. And the Iraqis reported back to Saddam Hussein that the Americans are just talking. Just talking. They don't mean to do anything. So they misinterpreted the message. Now that's very, very expensive. I mean, it costs the Iraqis billions of dollars and many lives, and it cost us a lot also that we had to fight, and it was not a very good thing. And you see the difference here between paying attention to how he said it. He was very calm. He just said, we're going to attack you if you don't move. Whereas they expected somebody to get excited, to throw something at them, to say, you must move out of Kuwait, otherwise I'm going to really fight you. Baker didn't do anything. And you know, Baker is a very cool type of person. He wouldn't get red in the face or anything of the sort. There are many other differences here. For example, collectivists apologize a lot, very high frequency apologizing. And they expect, of course, the other person to apologize much more. And that's a big issue because in one incident where we had a disagreement with the Chinese, and it had to do with flying some plane that had gotten too close to another plane and so on. The Chinese expected an apology, and we didn't give it to them because we don't expect to apologize. It was a normal thing to do, and we just don't apologize for something that's normal. But they expect an apology, and that's a different kind of culture in which an apology is much more likely to happen. Let's go to the next one. Okay. Yeah, the emphasis on harmony and modesty in collectivist cultures is very important. And a person is supposed to fit into the group. So it's very important to fit in. Negative feelings are not expressed very easily because that will break the relationship with other members of the group. So there's a suppression of negative feelings. You're very, very careful in how you talk to people. And in fact, very often they give in their communications very indirect signals. So for example, you say, please do such and such, and the person doesn't want to do. He will not say no. No would be too negative. He will say, well, I will try. You see, that's a very different thing to say. Now, I will try, an individualist will interpret as I will try. But that's not what they mean. What they mean with I will try is I'm not going to do it. So you can see here how difficult it is to get along if you don't understand the culture. Saving face is terribly important in collectivist cultures. And the behavior is much more a function of external factors, such as, for example, to what group you belong to, whereas in individualist cultures is much more a function of internal factors, what kind of personality you have and that kind of thing. And the self is defined by the roles that you have in a collectivist culture. And the self is easy to change so as to adapt in the group in the case of collectivists, but the self is much more steady in individualist cultures. Okay, let's go to the next one. In the case of failure, you have a real difference also. Failure is due to the self not having tried hard enough in collectivist cultures. And persistence is very, very high in collectivist cultures. Whereas in individualist cultures, you blame the task. You say, well, the task was too difficult, that's why I wasn't able to do it. So it's a very different thing in that in the collectivists blame themselves for not doing it. The individualists blame the group or the outside, the task, for not doing it. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Oh, here we have socialization. Yeah, so socialization in collectivist cultures is emphasizing reliability, conformity, follow traditions, do your duty. That's what children are supposed to do. In individualist cultures, on the other hand, being creative, inventive, etc., is much more important. And you receive a lot of social support in collectivist cultures as long as you do what you're supposed to do. If you break the norms, you are in trouble. And well-being is lower in collectivist cultures because your well-being depends on what other people think of you. You don't form your well-being on the basis of your own evaluation of how you're doing, but rather on the basis of what other people think of you. And of course, that means that you are not always sure what they're doing and what they think about you. Recreation is in stable groups in collectivist cultures. They usually have a few people that they meet over and over and over again, and that's their recreation. They don't try. The cocktail party was invented by individualists, so they're much more likely to sort of go to different groups and mix with different kinds of people and so on. That's what the individualists do. The collectivists stay with one group, and the group is usually pretty stable. Okay, let's go to the next one. Yeah, this is an interesting book. This book discusses the extent to which creativity is found in different cities of the United States. And essentially what he says is that there is more individualism and more creativity in certain cities like San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, and Boston than in other cities. So you can see here individualism is we already mentioned that individualism is higher near the coast, basically. But you see also that there are more creative people, they attract more creative people, they are richer, and they are more technologically savvy in certain cities. And he has all kinds of indices. He has a lot of indices about the cities. In fact, he has a kind of a map in this book about the kinds of cities that there are in the United States and the degree of creativity that you will find in the various cities. So it's a very interesting kind of thing. Okay, let's go to the next one. They're both high in individualism and in looseness in certain cities. Looseness, of course, means you marry the same sex partner, etc. That's much more loose than doing the usual thing that is done in certain cultures. Okay. Now, the new directions for research is essentially in the way the brain is operating and all the neural systems, and also the genes and the relationship between genes and culture, between brain operations and culture. So this is the new field, if you like. This is a new direction. And Kitayama is one of the major people in this area. This is an example you will find where he discusses how mind, brain, and culture are sort of mixed up and related to each other. And this cultural neurobiology is the new field. He even has a program of summertime workshops at the University of Michigan where he discusses this topic. Okay, let's go to the next one. There are some fascinating matters. For example, that certain genes occur more frequently in collectivist cultures than in other cultures. And there's the long variety and the short variety of the gene. And the long variety shows up more in the collectivist cultures. And if you correlate the level of collectivism of the culture and the kind of genes that are found in the culture, you get pretty nice correlations. So, and collectivists see the behavior as a function of external factors. We already mentioned that, whereas individuals see them as a matter of internal factors. And the difference can be traced to neural psychological findings in the way the brain functions. And that's really fascinating that you can actually do MRI kinds of studies and find that certain parts of the brain light up when you are thinking about external factors as opposed to internal factors. Okay, let's go to the next one. They have different patterns of neural activity, and some findings in cultural psychology can be traced to the ecology, which is shaped by culture. This is the general framework that I used before, and the tendency of collectivists to respond very differently to in-group and out-group members can be traced to the avoidance of disease. You see, if there is a lot of disease, you don't want to be in touch with people who are sick. So if they're not a member of your group, you stay away from them. And you deal very differently with them than you would if they are members of your group. And so you have a big difference between behavior when they are members of your group as opposed to members of outside your group. So there's a huge difference in behavior depending on whether you're dealing with somebody who is from your group or from outside your group. Okay, let's go to the next one. So in sum, ecology shapes culture. Culture can be conceptualized as a set of cultural syndromes, and each syndrome has behavioral consequences in interaction with the situation. That's sort of the general framework for thinking about this. Now let's go on to the next one. What I told you so far is about culture and psychology. Now the next topic is something that I got involved after I retired. I retired 15 years ago when I was 71 years old. And I was involved in writing 3 books since then. And one of the books I wrote is this one here, Fooling Ourselves. And let me tell you a little bit about it because I think that it has some future in terms of how culture is interacting with the fooling ourselves. When I retired, I did the usual thing that people do, reviewing papers and research proposals and so on for several years. But then 9/11 happened. And I saw in the New York Times that Mohammed Atta, the leader of the terrorists of 9/11, had a book in his luggage. It was a manual for the raid. That was the name of the book. And the manual said that what they did was, quotes, God's work. So I said, now that's very interesting. How could killing 3,000 innocent people be God's work? Didn't make sense to me, but let's find out. So I studied this whole problem for 6 years, and then I wrote this book. Because there are lots of examples of people thinking in a very, very strange way about the world. And when they are thinking of the world, they're thinking in a very different way from the way we think. Let me give you an example of the Aztecs, which is really fascinating. Now, the Aztecs used to take prisoners, and then they would take the heart of the prisoner while the prisoner was still alive with a blunt knife that was made out of stone. So it was terribly painful. But they would take it out, and they said to the people and to the hoi polloi in the Aztecs, if we didn't do this, the world would come to an end. And they believed it. So the priests were very, very important because they convinced the people that if they didn't do this, the world would come to an end. They kept the world going. So you can see here these tremendous self-deceptions that occur the way we fool ourselves. And so I wrote this book about self-deceptions in politics, religion, and terrorism, and you will see lots of examples of self-deception in these domains. Let me explain to you what I think about how I define self-deception. I think the self-deception has to do with the way we construct, the way we see the world. And we construct it on the basis of information that is both inside us, things like hopes, needs, desires, emotions, theories, ideologies, etc., and also what's outside us. Let's go to the next one. And so when we use mostly information that is from inside, we have very often self-deceptions. We are not realistic because we are not testing reality. Reality is out there. And only when we are being attacked by a wild animal, we pay 100% attention to the outside, to the wild animal. But when we are not doing this, then 100% of the information could come from inside. And then you get the person who says that Obama is not an American. Essentially, he's telling you what his ideology is, what his emotions are. I mean, that's the way he would like the world to be. And so he tells you what he likes the world to be, rather than what is the world. And we unfortunately very often have this kind of self-deception, and we have lots of self-deceptions. The biggest example we have right now is that global warming is not happening. There are lots of people who still believe this, which is unbelievable, but they still believe it, that global warming is not happening. It's a self-deception. They don't like it to happen. It's not consistent with their hopes, needs, and desires, so it doesn't happen. And that's what they say. Let's go on to the next one. The question then is, what is reality? And one way of thinking about reality is, I sort of looked around the world and I said, now what is happening around the world that everybody more or less agrees upon? People want to be healthy, both physically and mentally. They want to be happy. They want to live a long time, and they don't want to destroy the environment. That's generally agreed upon. If you go around the world and you ask people, what about that? You get a reasonable agreement. So we have 4 criteria, and we can use these 4 criteria also to rate cultures. We can see whether the culture allows people to be healthy, happy, so that they can live a long time without destroying the environment. Our own culture is not doing very well on that, but let's not talk about it now because it's already past 3 o'clock. But my argument in the book is that the purpose of life is to help as many people as possible to reach the goal of being healthy, happy, so that they will live a long time without destroying the environment. Yet people hold beliefs that are fantasies, such as reaching salvation, paradise, etc. All these are beliefs in their heads. They hope that this is the case, but it's not reality. Reality is out there, and reality is health, happiness, things that we can measure. And we can measure these things. In the book, I have a big discussion of how we measure, for example, health. You can look at such things as heart attack rates per 100,000, cancer rates of different kinds per 100,000, and so on. And you can compare cultures, and you can see that certain cultures are doing a better job than other cultures. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, I'll give you a few examples of self-deceptions. The president of Vietnam in 1945 said, the United States will be communist in 50 years. So that means in 1995. Well, you see how it is consistent with his hopes, needs, and desires. Well, he makes a fool of himself by saying that, because we were not communists in the year 1995. Of course, he wasn't alive anymore, so it didn't matter to him. But he said that. Now, the president of Iran is a good example of self-deceptions. He said that Israel will disappear from the world, will disappear from the face of the earth. Isn't that nice? Consistent with his hopes, needs, and desires again. So you can see here statements that people make with certainty. I mean, he was in front of the United Nations, and he said, actually at Columbia University, he said, we have no homosexuals in Iran. That's what he said. And people laughed. But he didn't care. He just said it and continued saying it. And now, of course, people are so scared to appear as homosexuals in Iran that they don't show up. But it is consistent with his hopes and desires that there are no homosexuals in Iran. Now, we know that in all cultures there are 5% approximately homosexuals. This is a well-established fact. In fact, higher apes very often are homosexual, and more frequently than we are. So this is very unlikely that there are none in Iran. But that's what he said. Another example from religion. Muhammad had a revelation, which is the Quran, that he got from God. Well, this is very nice, consistent with his hopes, needs, and desires, but it was not a revelation. It was actually something which is a very common phenomenon. About 10% of the population have hallucinations. And he went to a place which was very likely to have hallucinations. He was by himself. We know that if we isolate people for many hours, they develop hallucinations. This is an experiment that Donald Hebb did at McGill. So you do get hallucinations. And then, of course, you can interpret these hallucinations as coming from God. And, of course, that makes it much more interesting than saying that it's my own hallucinations. Another example from terrorism. Bin Laden made the statement that AIDS is an American invention to destroy Islam. That was consistent with his hopes, needs, and desires. And it certainly didn't have very much validity, but it doesn't matter. He wanted to see the world that way, and he said it. Now, you can find other examples. One of the interesting ways of measuring the extent to which people have self-deceptions is whether a large percent of the population does not believe in the theory of evolution. If you don't believe in the theory of evolution, you have a self-deception. So what percent of the population in various countries do not believe in the theory of evolution? Well, it turns out that this is stuff that Gallup poll has developed. About 20% in Scandinavia, 30% in Central Europe, 45% in the US, 60% in Turkey, and 92% in Egypt do not believe that the theory of evolution is valid. So they reject it. It is not consistent with their hopes, needs, and desires. And so they say it's not valid. Let's go on to the next one. I'm coming to an end very soon. Okay. I have a hypothesis that in collectivist cultures, self-deceptions take the form, my in-group is wonderful. So you will find that they will be very nationalistic. They will put their religion on a pedestal. They will say that's the only religion that's any good, etc. That's a characteristic of collectivist cultures. On the other hand, in individualist cultures, they will say, I am wonderful in some version. They will say, I have great competence, I'm a very valuable citizen, etc., etc. They will say good things about themselves. Now, it seems to me that it's very interesting to test this relationship between self-deception, because these are self-deceptions, basically, and culture. And I have a paper in which I discussed how this can be done. You measure culture and you also measure self-deceptions, and then you see whether they come together. And one of the findings, which sort of an observation that I made in the book, is that self-deceptions tend to be cognitively simple. Remember, we talked about cognitive simplicity earlier. Self-deceptions tend to be more cognitively simple. They also involve megalomania. Very often, you'll find megalomania in self-deceptions. A good example was Bin Laden. He thought that the whole world will become Islamic and he will be the caliph. Wonderful, isn't it? I mean, that's a superb self-deception. He will be the caliph of the world. That was the only important religious leader in the world. And the whole world will be Islamic and he will be in charge. So it's a marvelous self-deception. But you can see here how simplicity, first of all, it's very simple. The whole world becomes the same thing. That's very simple. We have more complexity if you have many different religions. That's more complex than having only one. And then, on top of that, he will be in charge. He will be the caliph. And that's megalomania. Lots of megalomania in these self-deceptions. This Norwegian guy who killed 77 people a couple of years ago, said in court that this was the most important event in European history since World War II. Isn't that nice? His own actions were the most important event in European history. In other words, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the dissolution of the USSR, the creation of the European Union, these kinds of things were not important. His behavior was very important. It's a megalomania. So you can see here how self-deceptions are very often cognitively simple, and they do involve megalomania. So let's one more. I think we're coming to the end. Yes. So the last point is that the world is pretty complex, but we tend to have the self-deception that it is simple, and we like it that way because we cannot really deal with this complexity. And so we sort of create a world which fits our hopes, needs, and desires, which is simple. And so we have self-deceptions, we fool ourselves, and that's not a very good situation. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you very much, Harry. I'll just open it up to questions from the floor. Anybody have a question? They always do this to me, Harry. I turn around, I look at them, and they never give me an answer, and I have to ask the first silly question. So let me ask you a question. You talk about how, especially a good example, I think, is European history. How European history at one point was very collectivist, very tight, but now is, I think, almost an epitome of the opposite, much looser, more individualistic. What's your understanding of how that process occurs? How do you shift from one to the other over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. What is happening is there is a high correlation between wealth, affluence, and individualism. So when Europe was poor, it was collectivist. And as it evolved and became richer and richer, certainly after the Industrial Revolution, it became individualist more and more. There are some interesting studies of how individualism developed in England. There's a book by Macfarlane, who is a British historian, who discusses various factors that, for example, primogeniture, the fact that only one son inherited the property of the parents, had something to do with creating individualism, because the other sons had to go and make life of their own. They had no support anymore, so that they had to sort of figure things for themselves. And according to Macfarlane, that really was a factor that increased individualism. But affluence seems to be the most important factor that created individualism. Okay?
I'll ask a question. Dr. Triandis, I'm Paul Davies. I'm a social psychologist here, and it's an honor to be speaking with you, sir. I've never had the pleasure of meeting you in person, but we have several colleagues in common. One of my PhD advisors was Dove Cohen, and one of my postdoc advisors was Hazel Marcus. And I was wondering, I've noticed that when tragedy strikes us in individualistic cultures like 9/11, we become far more collectivistic in our nature. That is, when the shit hits the fan, we become collectivistic. So I'm wondering if you think that individualism is really a luxury that we're afforded sometimes, but when times get tough, human nature requires collectivism.
Correlation of about 0.4 between tightness and collectivism. And remember some of the attributes that Michel Gelfand found. It included such things as being poor and having disease and having war and those kinds of things. You can go back to those slides that Gelfand had, which described tightness, and that is related to some extent with collectivism. And so what happens with 9/11 essentially is we became temporarily poorer, and we had a superordinate goal. And with a superordinate goal, we became more collectivist. But of course, we did not deal with it very well because we should at that point have self-sacrificed. There should have been an increase in our taxes, which would have been very easy to pass at that point. And there should have been self-sacrifice so that this collectivism would have resulted in a much better society. Instead, we engaged in a war which was nonsensical in Iraq, and we spent a lot of money on it, about $1.5 trillion, and we put it on a credit card, which was really very silly to do. So anyway, this is what happened, and you can analyze these things, and a lot of these things are in my book because I have a big discussion about self-deceptions that have occurred. Okay?
Are there any other questions? Yes, Maxine? You can see if you stand there. Okay.
Hi, Harry. Thank you for taking the time today. My name is Maxine Crawford, and I'm a PhD student here, and what I examine is how nature and wellness are correlated. And I was just wondering, I was curious about your comment about collectivistic versus individualistic cultures and the fish and the plant comment you made. And the research that I've looked at, I look primarily at urban versus rural cultures. And I was wondering what you would say around how individualism versus collectivism, in your experience, does that affect how people view their natural environment?
How they deal with the natural environment?
Yeah, does the collectivistic versus individualistic cultures have an impact on how people perceive their natural environment around them?
I think that's probably not related directly to collectivism, individualism. The reason being that the collectivists really pay a lot of attention to ancestors and descendants, so they would pay attention to the natural environment because about the descendants, but on the other hand, they don't have the resources to do very much about it. The individualists, on the other hand, have the resources. They usually are richer than the collectivists, so they are more able to deal with the natural environment. And because of that, that is, both the collectivists and the individualists have different reasons for or different ways of working with the environment. So I would anticipate no correlation, but I'm not sure. This is something to be discovered. Do the research, in other words. It might be there.
Hi, Dr. Triandis. My name is Tom Beggs. I'm doing a master's degree here at UBC. When I was listening to your descriptions of the dichotomies, I was stricken by the fact that you could almost characterize America as a country divided two separate countries. Now, this may just be a naive perspective of a Canadian watching an American election for the first time, but it really seemed like the red and blue states could be characterized on a lot of those scales as opponent. And I wasn't sure if you thought that having more political parties involved would help with that, meaning because you only have this simple choice in a complex environment, it polarizes, or whether you thought that's sort of more fundamental in American culture. You guys had a civil war, for example, so is that a fundamental dichotomy that will last, or is it something that would change if the environment changed? Do you agree with the characterization of the states as sort of a dichotomy at this point, or is that a false dichotomy?
Well, remember that these syndromes have other positions in between. You can be a collectivist in one domain, but not another domain. You can be very collectivist in one case and not so much in another. So it's not quite as simple as that. But I think your Canadian situation is more cognitively complex because you have more than two parties. Yeah. So you probably are better off than we are I think it would be better to have more than two parties, but unfortunately, the third party doesn't have much of a chance in this. I would have voted for the third party if it had a chance, but it has no chance. So I voted for.
Fair enough, thank you.
Any other questions? I've got one more, if you'll indulge me. You actually, I think we're touching on it right now, because you talked about this issue of complexity and simplicity in different domains. And you talked about how the sort of the Islamists, the extreme fundamentalist Islamics, believe in God's law, which in a very real sense is antithetical to science. So how does a culture like that manage to develop an atomic bomb and sophisticated equipment, which requires essentially on the premise of science? They have to do what you articulated. They have to keep part of their views separate in the context of this domain in order to be able to effectively deal with the drones.
Yes. Actually, the subgroup that developed the atomic weapons probably is a very small group that is not terribly religious. The culture as a whole is quite religious, but there can be pockets here and there where they're not religious, and I would expect that the scientists are not. But this whole issue of how Islam deals with science is a fascinating one, and I have a paper on it. I sent it to a journal. I don't know whether they will accept it. But anyway, what I discovered as I was reading about this is that in Islam, they used to have a better view of modernity than they have now. In other words, in the 1950s, they thought more highly of modernity and science and that kind of thing, whereas now they moved away from that towards mysticism and religion and that kind of thing. And there is a very interesting discussion by a guy by the name of Alavi. This is Alawi, I believe. But I can, if you email me, I will email you my paper so you can see the discussion. And what Alavi says is that there are two kinds of truth, in quotes. There's truth that comes from God and truth that comes from science. And the truth that comes from God is better than the truth that comes from science because it is not changing. That was the criterion that he used. It does not change. It's always the same. Whereas truth that comes from science, well, you can always change it. And I think that, on the contrary, if you can change it, it's better than if you have the same truth all the time. But that's a different point of view, you see. Alavi believes that if you don't change your beliefs, you're better than if you change them. So it's a fascinating issue, and I do have this discussion in the paper. I try to understand why there is more violence in Islam in that paper, and I can send it to you if you email me.
I'd be interested. I think part of the other issue, of course, is we always focus on Islam as if it's the sort of boogeyman. But if you look at Christianity, it has exactly the same history. It goes up, it goes down, it becomes more tolerant, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment period, and then it crashes and burns on the next wave, often in the context of sexuality, which happens to be my own area of interest.
As a matter of fact, one of the people that discussed my book was a minister, and he objected to my saying that Islam is more violent because he said, well, Christianity is pretty violent too. And I guess he probably is right. I don't know that much. I mean, I haven't measured violence that much. But I see a lot of violence related to Islam. I mean, if you just look around in Nigeria, in Pakistan, etc., they're blowing things up much more than in other places. So anyway, there is an issue here, and you may be right that Christianity is just as bad and had just the same sorts of phases. And it may be actually that there's a kind of continuum. You start by being very much more violent, and then you become a little more controlled. There's a very nice book by Pinker that I recommend, in which he discusses how violence has decreased over the centuries. Now, he finds that there is much less violence now than there used to be, and he has lots of data to support it. So I think there is a reduction in violence, and Islam has not caught up yet, and so it continues being rather violent.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Once again, we really want to express our appreciation for your allowing us this technology and probably suffering a certain amount of anxiety on your end when the computers didn't always work properly. Thanks again, sir.
Everything right?
Well, I didn't catch that last part.
I'll turn off my computer.
Yes, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yeah, I'll turn off the computer and I'll turn off the,
Yes.
The telephone.
Okay.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Very good, very fun.
Now be different.